Buenos días, bienvenidas y bienvenidos a todo el mundo, a los que estáis presentes en la sala y a quienes estáis siguiendo esta sesión a través de Internet por el canal de la Cátedra Jean Monnet de Historia de Europa y de la Integración Europea. Vamos a comenzar con la siguiente sesión de nuestro taller dedicado a Europa y los derechos humanos en perspectiva histórica. Y en esta ocasión tenemos el honor de tener con nosotros a la profesora Silvia Salvatici, a la que voy a presentar a continuación, que va a desarrollar el tema Solidarity Networks Across Southern Europe, Transnational Trade Union Campaigns for Political Prisoners, 1960-1975. Como todas las sesiones de este ciclo, la dinámica será una dinámica de seminario al comienzo, con una conferencia o intervención a la que seguirá un turno de palabra, de preguntas, comentarios. Las personas presentes en la sala las pueden hacer directamente y quienes estén siguiendo la sesión online nos pueden escribir en el chat del canal de YouTube las preguntas que quieran que hagamos llegar a la profesora Salvatici. A continuación haremos una breve pausa y seguirá una sesión más práctica, ¿de acuerdo? Sin más, voy a presentar a la profesora Salvatici. Thank you very much, Silvia, for being here, for coming and express for this session. La profesora Salvatici es doctora, tiene un doble doctorado. Tiene dos tesis doctorales, una en Ciencias Históricas por la Universidad de Estudios, o la Facultad de Estudios Históricos, mejor dicho, de la Universidad de San Marino, en el año 1995, y una tesis doctoral en Historia de la familia y de las identidades de género en el Instituto Universitario Oriental de Nápoles, en 1997. Como profesora, trabajó primero como profesora, assistant professor y después associate professor, lo que sería ya un profesor titular, digamos, profesora titular en la Universidad de Teramo, y en 2015 se unió a la Universidad de Milán. Desde noviembre de 2021 es profesora catedrática, diríamos en español, catedrática en el Departamento de Ciencias Políticas y Sociales en la Universidad de Florencia. La profesora Salvatici fue Honorary Research Fellow en la Facultad de Historia, de Estudios Clásicos y de Arqueología de Birkbeck College, Associate Research Fellow en la Italian Academy de Columbia University y Fernand Braudel Senior Fellow en el Instituto Universitario de Florencia en el Departamento de Historia y Civilización. También ha sido, entre sus incontables méritos que resumo, ha sido solo unos pocos, Susan Corrier Visiting Professor for Teaching Excellence in Gender and Humanitarianism en el College of Liberal Arts, California Polytechnic State University. Entre sus muy numerosas publicaciones, solo quiero mencionar su libro más reciente, creo, hasta la fecha, que es A History of Humanitarianism, una historia del humanitarismo desde 1755 a 1989, que tiene como subtítulo In the Name of Others, publicado en 2019, y además ha publicado sus investigaciones en las mejores revistas de historia contemporánea y materias anexas o cercanas como The Historical Journal, Journal of Contemporary History, European Review of History, Journal of Refugee Studies, Le Mouvement Social, Contemporánea o European History Quarterly. Y lo último que quiero destacar, y para que ya tengan el placer de poder escuchar a la profesora Salvatici, es que es la investigadora principal de un proyecto, una RC, como decimos en español, un European Research Project Council, un RC decimos, aquí todo lo españolizamos, Silvia. Un proyecto fantástico del que seguro que nos va a hablar hoy, titulado, bueno, no tengo el título completo, lo dirá ella, pero el proyecto es Human Euromed, ¿de acuerdo? Bueno, creo que está introducida someramente nuestra ponente. De nuevo, thank you a lot, Silvia, and welcome to Madrid, welcome to Universidad Complutense and to the Jean Monnet Chair in History and History of European Integration, and the floor is yours.
So, buenos dias a todos y todas, and the Spanish finishes here, and I go on in English. And so, many thanks for this extremely generous presentation, and many thanks to my colleagues at the University Complutense of Madrid for having me today. It's a pleasure and a great honor to present a part of my research within this lecture series on the history of human rights in Europe. So the case study I will discuss today forms part of the, how do you say in Spanish?
RC.
RC project that Carlos mentioned already. And the full title is Human Euromed, Humanitarianism and Mediterranean Europe, a Transnational and Comparative History, 1945-1990. And what you can see in the slide is just our website. And don't tell anybody that I didn't put the logo of the ERC, but I forgot it, so it's a secret. Okay. I will begin by outlining the historiographical and methodological premises of the Human Euromed project. Then I will focus on the specific case study I'm presenting today, which concerns the mobilization of the Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and Greek workers' organizations on behalf of political prisoners. And finally, I will highlight how this case study engages with several important historiographical strands: the history of human rights, the scholarship on democratic transitions in Southern Europe, and the history of international humanitarianism in the second half of the 20th century. So, about the project. If we wished to summarize as concisely as possible the meaning and purpose of the Human Euromed project, we could say that its greatest ambition is to introduce a new perspective into studies of international humanitarianism. These studies experienced an intense development over the past 20 years in the wake of the historiographical turn of the 1990s, but also stimulated by the questions raised by the present time. The roundtable published in Past and Present in 2018 examines exactly this rapid expansion of the scholarship on the history of humanitarianism and considers the various paths taken by the research. There is one aspect that is not mentioned in this debate, but which in my view is highly significant. The conspicuous scholarship on humanitarianism has mainly examined the experience of donor countries in Northern Europe, and particularly the United Kingdom and the United States, while countries in Southern Europe have largely been overlooked. The few works that concern them focus on the aftermath of World War II, particularly for Italy and Greece, and see them mainly as recipients of aid, as recipients countries. This imbalance, of course, is due primarily to the large quantity of resources, both human and material resources, that the USA and Northern European states, and particularly UK, have invested in international aid, which positioned them as the primary architects of the contemporary humanitarian regime. Yet, much like what happened with global history, the history of humanitarianism ultimately presented a skewed vision. On the one hand, the United States and the driving countries of Europe, namely UK, portrayed as central players in the construction of the modern system of international aid. On the other hand, the countries of Mediterranean Europe have been seen as marginal players, scarcely able to play an active role as donors because they themselves were backward and weak, both politically and economically. So the project Human Euromed aims to challenge this skewed vision by placing Mediterranean Europe at the center of the inquiry. The main objective is not just to close the geographical gap, let's say, by adding Southern Europe to the existing literature, so adding a piece that is missing. Rather, the aim is to rethink the analytical tools and the interpretative proposals developed by the historiography, starting from the specific feature of the Southern European countries' experience. There is a further methodological aspect that I would like very, very briefly to highlight. Within the Human Euromed project, humanitarianism is not analyzed per se, but is conceived as a lens through which to read the history of Southern Europe in the context of some of the most significant political, social, and economic transformation which marked the second half of the 20th century. Why I stress this point? I stress this point because it seems to me that the historiography on humanitarianism and that on human rights tend to be somewhat self-referential, engaging primarily within their own respective fields, so it's a sort of internal dialogue, internal debate, rather than engaging with broader debates. And I will return on this at the end of my talk. Let me now move towards introducing my case study. Placing Southern Europe at the center has meant engaging with the presence of authoritarian regimes until the mid-1970s and with the subsequent democratic transitions, as these constitute a defining feature of the region's history. This led to the development of a specific research strand within the project dedicated to humanitarianism and democratic transitions. So the aim has been to explore the role of humanitarian concerns in promoting anti-authoritarian pressures, facilitating democratic transitions, and consolidating democratic governance in Spain, Portugal, and Greece. I won't go into detail here about how this objective has been pursued. In case we can come back to this during the Q&A session. And since Julia and Alan took part in the workshop in which we discussed this issue of the entanglements between humanitarianism and democratic transition, I'm pretty sure that they can contribute to the discussion. Now what I want to stress here is just that I developed my own research exactly within this framework. And I must admit that the sources themselves prompt me to investigate the mobilization of trade union organizations on behalf of political prisoners. I didn't have in mind this topic at the very beginning. My aim was to examine the solidarity initiatives promoted from Italy, but it was very important for me to situate the experiences of Spain, Portugal, and Greece within a single analytical framework, put together all the three countries which faced resistance to authoritarian regimes between the 1960s and the 1970s. So I felt it was essential to take up the call of recent historiography on democratic transitions, which has urged scholars to pursue a comparative and cross-cutting analysis of the Spanish, Portuguese, and Greek experiences. I'm pretty sure you know this scholarship much better than I do, but in any case, very inspiring in this direction of keeping all the three countries together were to me the edited volume by Cavallaro and Cornetis and the special issue of the Melanges de la Casa de Velázquez. And you find them in this slide. So at first, I thought of focusing on political refugees who arrived in Italy from Spain, Portugal, and Greece. And I was aware that trade unions had contributed to their assistance. But the archival material led me in a different direction, as it revealed the importance of the solidarity networks that linked Italian trade unions with their Spanish, Portuguese, and Greek counterparts. Within these solidarity initiatives, the issue of political prisoners, framed as a humanitarian concern, and the call for amnesty quickly emerged as central. So since I have mentioned the sources, let me briefly show you the archives I consulted. I know this might not be of great interest to those who are not historians. I know this is a multidisciplinary group, but for us historians, you know, demonstrating archival work is, I would say, a matter of professional identity. So, of course, the documentation I found in these different archives varied significantly, especially in quantitative terms. And the richest holdings turned out to be the Italian ones. So the richest collection were those of the Italian trade unions organizations. However, consulting this plurality of archives allowed me to cross-read the documents and to shed light on the role played by all the actors involved in the co-construction of discourses on human rights and humanitarian practices. Why I'm stressing this? Because my aim was to move beyond the asymmetric perspective so common in the scholarship that placed the, let's say, supply side of aid at the center and portrays the so-called recipients as passive actors. So let me give you a couple of concrete examples drawn directly from the archival documents of the role played by labor organizations in Spain, Greece, and Portugal, although the examples are on Spain and Greece, in shaping both the forms and the content of solidarity campaigns. So here you see a letter sent to the Confederazione Generale Italiana del Lavoro. The acronym is CGL, which is the most important Italian trade union, which had, let's say, a socialist and communist background. And the letter was sent by the Greek Anti-Dictatorial Workers' Front. AEM is the acronym, one of the unions formed after the colonel's coup in 1967. In this letter, which is in Greek, so I'll ask you to take my word for it, the AEM addressed specific requests to the CGL, ranging from radio equipment to keep the organization alive and able to communicate, to assistance for the families of political prisoners. That was a very important aid program, and I will come back to it in a moment. But the letter also included suggestions regarding the content of the information campaigns through which the CGL was expected to support the Greek union struggle against the dictatorship. So the documents preserved in the Contemporary Social History Archives in Athens, together with those in the CGL archive, allowed me to reconstruct, as I was saying, the process of co-construction through which campaigns for political prisoners were shaped. And I have another example, which is this letter sent by the political prisoners of Burgos, sent again to the CGL, probably channeled by the UGT. Well, I don't have to explain what it is, because at the very beginning, you know, in the early 1960s, the main relationship of the CGL was with the UGT. Then the main relationship was with the Comisiones Obreras. I'll be back to it. But, sorry, this is not the letter from the political prisoners of Burgos. I got confused with the later slide because it's far and I cannot see very well. But this is a letter from the Comisiones Obreras, exactly in 1967. I'll be back to the letter from the political prisoners in Burgos. I beg your pardon. But this is exactly a letter with the sent by the Comisiones Obreras in 1967. And it's better if I look at my back, so I can see better. And here, the suggestion given to the CGL was focused exactly on how to develop the solidarity campaign, what to do, particularly about the fundraising. And the suggestion of the responsible of the Comisiones Obreras in Madrid was exactly to send to how to raise the money, collecting the money within the factories and having donation worker by worker, because that was not related to the amount of money at the end collected, but was related to the relationship of solidarity that was needed to strengthen the union between the working class of Italy and the working class of Spain. So, yet another example on how the so-called recipients contributed to shape both the content and the form of the solidarity campaigns. And let me get to another very crucial point. How is the issue of political prisoners presented in the sources? And above all, why did it assume such central importance within the transnational mobilization of workers against the dictatorship of Southern Europe? So why is immediately the issue of political prisoners came at the center of the mobilization and the claim for amnesty? I believe that this issue can be addressed by highlighting a crucial point. In the view of trade union organizations, political prisoners were individuals subjected to a double violation, as workers and as human beings. First, let me explain this statement about the former aspect. Workers undoubtedly constituted a significant proportion of the victims of political persecution. But more importantly, and this is the key point in my opinion, for trade unions, they were political prisoners precisely because they were workers. Their unjust detention was rooted in the systematic violation of labor rights under the fascist regimes of Southern Europe, and in the case of Greece, already under the authoritarian government of Constantino Karamanlis, immediately prior, let's say, to the 1967 coup. Second point, second issue, political prisoners were portrayed as individuals deprived of their freedom, held in inhumane conditions. This is a term which recur frequently, inhumanity. People subjected to abuse and torture and exposed to the risk of death penalty. These aspects on which the document consistently insists are crucial into the document. In other words, this aspect foreground the violation of human rights perpetrated by dictatorial regimes. So, what distinguishes the mobilization of trade union organizations from campaigns on behalf of political prisoners led by other actors, so for example, Amnesty International, which was developing in the same years, is the tight link established between the violation of human rights and the violation of workers' rights. This also marked the political agenda of trade union mobilization, within which the struggle for democracy in Mediterranean Europe, the defense of workers' rights, the protection of human rights were deeply intertwined and inseparable. I would like to illustrate this intertwining by taking you again inside the documents, where this intertwining is consistently reproduced. Of course, I have selected just a couple of documents, so don't be worried. It won't be so long. The first is the very famous letter from the prisoners of Burgos, sorry. And that was probably channeled by the Unión General de Trabajadores, because it arrived in 1963, if I'm not wrong. Yes. In the opening, the authors of the letter evoked the shared experience of Italy and Spain. Both countries had endured the harshness of fascist dictatorship. This appealed to a common experience, both of fascism but also of anti-fascism, was also very frequently made by Greeks and Portuguese. They call on the common experience. But what is particularly significant here is the identification of human rights violation as a constitutive element of fascist dictatorship. So I quote from the letter, the fascist repression is defined as the one that stifled the most basic rights of man. As a consequence, the cause of political prisoners, and here there is a sentence that emphasizes the very bad conditions in which political prisoners are forced to live, so forced to drag out their lives in the damp cells of Francoist prisoners. So the concern of political prisoners was not only a Spanish concern, this is clearly stated, but one that affected all of humanity. These issues resurfaces in the documents of the Greek anti-dictatorial workers' front, AEM, which were sent to the three major Italian confederations, so CGIL, but also CISL. You can see two documents. The first one is a lengthy dossier on the condition of workers in Greece, and documents of this kind circulated very widely, exactly because the aim was to show, to give the evidence of the poor condition of life of workers in the three countries under dictatorships, and also of the violation of the workers' rights in all the countries. So this kind of dossier circulated widely. As indicated in the table of contents that you can see in the slide, one of the sections of this dossier was devoted to the Juntas attack on trade union freedom and human dignity, so they are bound together, and on workers' rights. So workers' rights, human rights, they are the same, I mean, the two faces of the same coin. Here, too, the emphasis was placed on the denial of human rights as one of the defining features of the regime. And it is claimed in the document that one of the representatives of the junta declared, we, as junta, are not interested in human rights. So the violation of human rights is a qualification of the dictatorship of Greece. The second document is a letter requesting continued support for the AEM's struggle against the dictatorship and for political prisoners. So here the issue of political prisoners is crucial, and they are described as subjected to an inhumane regime in the Greek fascist prison. So here you can see an example of this recurrent use of the term inhumane. So international solidarity was deemed necessary to demand firmly that all, I quote, all political detainees be released. But this was only, let's say, an immediate objective. The ultimate goal was, and I quote again, to restore the democratic and trade union freedoms of the Greek people. End of quote. So amnesty was not an end in itself, but rather a means to overturn the dictatorship and build a democratic state broadly defined by the respect for human rights and workers' rights. So in contrast to the mobilization of human rights that we might broadly describe as liberal mobilization for human rights, embodied above all by Amnesty International. So in contrast to it, trade union mobilization was part of an explicit political project. Roland Barthes, as you probably know, one of the scholars who has most significantly contributed to the history of human rights, in the chapter that you see quoted in the slide, has argued that in the decades following the Second World War, the international debate among jurists and international actors identified democracies as, I quote, the right kind of sovereign state for human rights. But we find this same identification within labor internationalism. However, for labor internationalism, there was no democracy without the effective recognition of workers' rights. So the recognition and the respect of human rights was not enough. Alongside the denunciation of human rights violations, the Trade Union Solidarity Network also provided direct assistance to the families of political prisoners. These initiatives that we can, let's say, more easily recognize as humanitarians embodied two closely interconnected aims. On the one hand, there was the material support offered to people whose condition of need was fully recognized. The family of political prisoners were described as deprived of any form of income and forced to live in the institution. Assistance, therefore, constituted a necessary humanitarian act. It constituted the response to that imperative to help, which has been identified by the scholarship as the driving impulse underlying humanitarianism. So let's say there is a purely humanitarian impulse, but at the same time, many documents stressed that the hardship faced by the Spanish, Greek, or Portuguese families affected by political persecution under fascist regimes were well known to Italian workers because they also had experienced, or they were still experiencing it in the 1960s. So in other words, all the actors involved appealed to the traditional international solidarity of labor movement and to its, let's say, horizontal dimension. Only workers could support one another because only they truly understood the reality of their own conditions of need and oppression. So the program of material assistance to the family of political prisoners represented the most tangible point of convergence between political and humanitarian dimensions of international labor solidarity. Just to give you a concrete example of this initiative, humanitarian initiatives, one of the most significant example of direct assistance was the sponsorship program for the families of political prisoners that I briefly mentioned before, which involved both Spain and Greece. In what consisted this sponsorship of families of political prisoners? Local trade unions branches, the Camera del Lavoro, for those who are familiar with the trade union system in Italy, sponsored one family of political prisoners in Spain or Greece and sent supplies and, above all, financial support. Often, as in the case shown in the slide, the provision of aid was accompanied by correspondence. And this correspondence linked individual families to groups of Italian trade unionists and strengthened the bonds of solidarity also at local level. It was exactly meant, this initiative, to build a network of solidarity that did not involve only the headquarters in Rome or the big local institution, but also the very small local groups of unionists in the field in Italy. And I want to show you another one, another example of this correspondence, which is very different from the one that I showed you in the previous slide. But this is a document sent by Marcellino Camacho, and I'm pretty sure I don't have to introduce him, to the three Italian confederations, CGL, CSL, and particularly to the section of metallurgic workers, reunited in Emilia-Romagna and Ravenna. And at the very beginning of this very long lecture that deals with political and strategic issues about the solidarity networks between the Commissiones Obreras and Italian trade union organizations, he thanks the Italian trade union organizations for the aid that arrived to his wife, since he was himself a political prisoner. And here I want just to mention a dimension that I don't have the time to explore, to fully explore and now, but if you want, we can come back to it in the discussion. That is the gender dimension of these solidarity networks, because the majority of political prisoners were, as you know, males. But women played a crucial work, not only in keeping relationships with the Italian trade unions, but also in bringing, in making the cause of political prisoners public in Italy. They came to Italy, they participated in public conferences and events of different kinds, and they did so exactly under the request of the Commissione Sobrera. There is a very interesting letter addressed to the three Italian confederations in which the Commissione Sobrera exactly stated, we have decided to send to Italy the wives, a group of wives of political prisoners, because they can offer direct witness of what is happening here and of the life conditions of political prisoners in Spain. So this is the gender dimension I cannot explore. Okay, sorry, I lost my part. No, I have good news. I'm moving towards the conclusion. As I anticipated, I would like to highlight how my research engages with three major historiographical fields: that of democratic transitions, that of human rights, and that of humanitarianism. So, the historiography on democratic transitions, which, as you know, received significant impetus around the centenary of the end of dictatorships in Southern Europe. And this scholarship is very complex. So I will limit myself to highlight just a few aspects. I can safely say that my research embraces the invitation advanced by more recent studies to investigate a plurality of actors who opposed dictatorships and facilitated the transition to democracies. So not only the political and institutional elites, but a plurality of actors. So the case of trade union mobilization demonstrates the role of transnational solidarity networks in conferring legitimacy and strength on workers' organizations resisting authoritarian regimes. And there are some work, particularly about Spain, on the role that workers' organizations played in pressuring the regime and building them and contributing to democratic transition, but only, let's say, seen in the frame of the national history. Here, I think I can offer a contribute in the direction of interpreting it in a transnational frame. And what also emerges from my research, I believe, is the significance of the international dimension. And you can say, but we know that the international dimension was very significant. But I think we can say that most of the scholarship that investigated the role of these international dimensions explored it, mainly looking at the interstate relations within the framework of the Cold War. Here we have the relevance of the international dimension, but seen from another perspective. This is, more bottom-up experience. So the historiography on human rights. 30 years ago already, Virginia Larry argued that historically there has been no convergence between human rights and workers' rights because the international labor movement never regarded workers' rights as part of the broader corpus of human rights. Her conclusion was later taken up by numerous other studies, which reiterated the argument about the historical separation between human rights and workers' rights. This is a sort of general assumption. My research, I think, encourages us to rethink this separation. Because within the transnational solidarity networks mobilized on behalf of political prisoners, human rights and workers' rights became intertwined. Neither could be fully realized without the other. So there was not, let's say, a theoric conceptualization of workers' rights as human rights. But in the practice, they were bound together. A few further reflections on the historiography of human rights. I believe we are all familiar by now with the recent debate on the periodization of the history of human rights. A large, complex, and let me say, a bit redundant debate. And I don't want to recall it. I want just to stress the prevailing interpretation that according to which only in the second half of the 1970s, human rights gained a prominent position on the agenda of international activism and more broadly of international politics. And you have mentioned there the most famous works which introduced this interpretation. Interpretation which is now widely accepted in all the work that you see, is taken for granted that human rights were born in the 1970s. Okay, it is precisely this periodization that led Federico Romero, we know very well him, I mean, at least a few of us, led Federico Romero to identify a clear shift taking place in the second half of the 1970s. According to Romero, I am referring to the article mentioned in the slide. According to Romero, the end of the dictatorships in Spain, Portugal, and Greece marked the decline of the, I quote, emotional, cultural, and political traction of anti-fascism. And in the wake of this decline, the decline of anti-fascism, the discourse of human rights is said to have asserted itself in the international arena. So the traction of human rights, the traction of anti-fascism was declining, and on the other side you had the human rights discourse that was rising. This is certainly a well-grounded analysis. However, in the transnational mobilization of workers on behalf of political prisoners, the traction of anti-fascism was closely linked to the denunciation of the violation of individuals' fundamental rights from the early 1960s onwards. So anti-fascism, and at least not only in the discourse, but in the mobilization of trade unions, transnational mobilization of trade unions, anti-fascism and human rights discourse did not, so to speak, follow one another in sequence. Before you had the anti-fascism, then you had the human rights. Rather, they developed simultaneously, and they coexisted and intermingled for many years. So I would argue that we should broaden our inquiry to include the less visible circulation of human rights language that occurred before it fully entered the field of international relations. So before the so-called breakthrough. It existed before. It circulated. It was less visible, but it was there. So more nuance. I had to nuance the breakthrough. Okay, to conclude, really, this time. The interaction between my research and the historiography on humanitarianism. Most studies, of which the slide shows only a few examples among many possible ones, have paid limited attention to actors who cannot be identified as humanitarians in strict sense. Most of the research is rather devoted to the National Society of Red Cross, the Red Cross International Movement, or the major humanitarian NGOs as Save the Children, Oxfam, and so on. In my view, this focus on strictly defined humanitarian actors is due to the widespread assumption that humanitarianism is, by definition, neutral and therefore apolitical. And this assumption, that we can discuss, of course, has led to the exclusion of actors such as political parties or trade unions from the analytical frameworks. Only strictly defined humanitarian actors did humanitarian work. So in my research, workers' solidarities emerged at the intersection between the recognition of the suffering endured by political prisoners and their families. So from a humanitarian impulse and the pursuit of a political project. And this political project consisted of the end of dictatorships, respect for human rights, and full recognition of workers' rights, all essential conditions for building a democratic Southern Europe. And let me stress this point that, again, if you want, we can develop in the discussion. Italy was included in this democratic Southern Europe to be constructed, or to be, in the case of Italy, reinforced, because it was not safe from potential arrival of dictatorship, since it was, okay, let's stop it here. So, I believe we need to broaden our perspective. And I think this is the strong message coming from our research on humanitarianism in Southern Europe. To broaden our perspective, to include actors who are not strictly humanitarian, and to examine the interplay between humanitarian impulses and clearly political agendas. So political agendas that want to be political agendas, claimed as political agendas. Doing so would also enable the historiography on humanitarianism to engage more productively with the broader questions currently shaping historiographical debate on the contemporary age. And with this very last statement, I'm back to the beginning of my talk, and I thank all of you for your attention. Thank you so much. Thank you.
So thank you very much, dear Silvia, Professor Salvatici. It was really very interesting, your proposal for a broadened conception and an expanded conception of humanitarianism, also with a very broad chronological perspective and also geographically, this intertwingle of societies and case studies. We have time now for questions and answers and also for comments, both from our listeners here, on our followers online. So, tenemos tiempo para preguntas, respuestas. No sean tímidos y pueden lanzarse. Pueden preguntarse. Gracias, muchas gracias. Thank you very much. Gracias. Pues vamos a hablar aquí español, italiano, inglés. ¿Quién sabe? ¿Quién sabe si algo más? De acuerdo. Gracias también por ello, Silvia. Pablo, adelante, por favor.
Oh, thank you so much for the fascinating talk. I have 2 questions. Not an expert on the topic, so feel free to also disregard. Or I was curious about the category political prisoner, and I again from a completely different field. I'm interested in whether you saw in the sources if they actually do work to conceptualize what actually means, because I think it's a term that is constantly changing, being reshaped, and I can also see from a different perspective again that for instance, the Francoist regime is trying to depoliticize that term. So they call them terrorists, or they call them saboteurs, or they use other categories to actually stress that the crime is not political at all. So they shouldn't be considered labeled political prisoners. I can imagine that from the other side, there is an effort to conceptualize and categorize that term. And I can also imagine that plays a part also in wider discussions, legal discussions that are taking place at the time, also the rise of terrorism. I think the Council of Europe is working on this, but also like all these international networks of lawyers, they're working on this. I can imagine that maybe they contribute to shaping those discussions. And the second question, very quickly, I was very interested in this obsession with workers, and so and I was wondering what happens when all of a sudden there are these campaigns, for instance, for students. Because I can imagine that this is the emergence of students, late 60s, early 70s, as very active political actors. They are imprisoned in Spain, they're imprisoned in Portugal. So there are also these massive international campaigns to release them. What is the reaction? Because it's a kind of also in Italy we saw that there's a complicated relationship between workers and students. Students are partly bourgeois. So how do they readapt to this? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes. Right? Lucky me that you're not an expert because they are so well focused. So. Okay, Paolo, thank you very much for these 2 questions, which really raise crucial points. Okay, political prisoners. I would like to stress that the use of the term political prisoners was in itself political. Because, for example, Amnesty International, that we associate with political prisoners, but it didn't use the term political prisoners. It used the term prisoners of conscience. There was the idea that someone could not express the convictions and the ideas related to its own conscience. And so it was broadened also to religion, for example. But the use of this term, and Buchanan's work is very to the point and very, it dwells a lot on it. The idea was to keep far from politics. Exactly. So nothing to do have nothing to do with politics. The issue of being imprisoned because of the ideas, individual's idea has to do with the conscience, not with politics. So the use of the term political prisoners was very important in itself because it's revenged to develop a political agenda. I didn't find anything that was really, let's say, a conceptualization of the issue of political prisoners. I must say that most of the work, most of the papers in the trade union archives deal with the practice, what to do, and with the policies and what it implied, all this mobilization for political prisoners, also in terms of trade union policies. But they've relied a lot on the jurists, And for example, one of the main line of the concrete help given to political prisoners and their families was to collect money to pay the costs of the trials. So there was a special collection, for example, for the very famous 1001 trial in Madrid, and so they were closed related. And here, if I'm too long, let me know. And here there is another issue that is very important, and your question opened a perspective also on this other issue. The Italian trade unions did not develop their initiatives and their solidarity campaign alone. And this is, I think, is very important because they open it up to other civil society organizations. Well, not organization, informal groups. Tens of informal groups were born in these years, dealing with political prisoners in Spain, Portugal, and Greece, and they worked closely with the trade unions organization. They developed a lot of initiatives together. And in many cases, those civil societies group were funded exactly by jurists, democratic jurists. So there is a dialogue with those who deal with the issue from the juridical point of view, but there is not a political conceptualization. But in all the articles published in the press, for example, also the CISL press, which is the Catholic Italian trade union organization, is stressed that they are blamed as terrorists, but they are political prisoners. So it's faced, the Italian trade unions, particularly in the press, they face this issue. They face the fascist propaganda, and they want to deconstruct it. Students, crucial point. Exactly, because at the very beginning, I was in the archives. I was looking for students because I knew, for example, in Italy, one of the most important foreign student groups in Italy in those years during the, particularly from the end of the 60s and the mid of the 70s, were exactly the Greek, not the Spanish, but the Greek. And you know why this is, I'm sorry, I'm just going a little bit out of the field, but because according to the agreement on the reparation for the Second World War, Greek students did not pay the tax for the attendance of the university in Italy. So a lot of Italian students came to Italy, and they were not all of them were recognized. They came to Italy even before, and then they became somehow refugees in reality after the coup. So it was a very important movement, but I found so little in the trade union archives about the relationship with the students. It's a pity that we have to say that, but they developed quite separately. There were a few initiatives organized together. I found traces of this in Milan, particularly the Federation of the Trade Unions and the students, the organization of students, but not so many, and somehow in Turin. The idea that I got from the documents, but I wouldn't write it because I don't have enough on it. But the idea is that they were united more into the field, the organization of single demonstration, single event, debate, but not at the organizational level. Undoubtedly not in Rome, not at the headquarters. But that is a very crucial point. Thank you so much.
Yo tendría una pregunta, mientras surgen otras, y voy a decirla en español, pero
Sí,
luego
if I don't understand, I just let
me
you
puedo autotraducir si es necesario. Mi pregunta tiene que ver con espacios geográficos y conceptuales. El concepto de derechos humanos, por naturaleza, es universal. Mi pregunta es, ¿hay algo en los relatos que tú ves, en la fórmula, en el lenguaje, que hable de un estándar europeo de derechos humanos? Cuestiones como, esto no puede ocurrir en Europa.
Yeah.
Y lo pregunto, y lo pregunto porque, bueno, primero porque este es una cátedra, de acuerdo, Jean Monnet, y claro, en los años 70 se formula la identidad política europea, la cooperación política europea, y vinculada a un estándar, ¿no?, de derechos humanos más elevado quizá que otras partes. Entonces me interesa mucho si existe este lenguaje.
Thank you very much indeed.
Sí,
You
juega
don't
un
need
papel.
translation. I did understand.
Gracias.
You spoke very clearly, so it was easy to me. Yeah, okay, let me start from the end. Because, let's say, everything started from the European Economic Committee, because the mobilization, not only among trade union organizations, but let's say at more general level in Europe, started at the beginning of the 1960s, exactly because Spain and Portugal and Greece a bit later, they attempted to be part of the European Economic Committee, and there was a strong reaction from all the democratic forces in Europe, and also that was a very important argument for the opposition within the single countries. Say, come on, you guys, you cannot let Spain or Portugal or Greece to get into the EEC. So that was strictly related, and again in the press you can find these issues as very important. You know, they cannot be part of the community of European countries because they do not respect human rights and workers' rights, because the perspective is always from the point of view of trade union organization, is always the perspective of the workers' rights. And also the mobilization of Southern European trade unions was connected to the mobilization of international trade union organizations, particularly the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions, and also the World Federation of Trade Unions. But for the issue of the EEC, it was more important the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions, because it was connected to many other countries, democratic countries, while the other was the one of the communist countries. And particularly the CISL, that was the Italian Catholic trade union organization, and the WILD, that was the Social Democratic Italian trade union organization. They were a member of the organization of free trade unions. So all the initiatives were connected. And also what I find, let me say that, what I find really fascinating in my research, not because it's my research, but because I got passionate exactly because of this, that you can see really this mobilization, the different scales of this organization, from the single Camera del Lavoro in a small village of Emilia-Romagna to the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions, because the CISL and WILD were connected to it, and exactly the point was, and they republished, for example, all the public statement of the International Federation into the local, the national press. So there was exactly the idea that you need to respect human rights connected to worker rights, because this is the way how they see them to be part of the European community. But dealing with the geographical space, there was another box. There are different boxes within each other. There was the one of Southern European countries. I would say, the regional conceptualization of human rights, labor rights, and democracy. Because what was very clear to all the actors involved, it was that democracy was very well established in, in Western democratic, Western democratic countries, but it was unstable in Italy. When there is a coup in 1967 in Greece, really, Italian democratic forces, they were very worried that there was this wave of dictatorship and another military coup in Italy, and they were not wrong to be worried. So the perspective, this political agenda I was talking about is pretty much a Southern European political agenda. It's something that they wanted to strengthen, strengthen the democracy in Italy, and make Italy safer in front of potential military coup, and of course turning down the dictatorship in Spain, Portugal, and Greece, and re-establish democracy. Somehow, let's say, they want to fill the gap between Western European countries and Southern Europe, because Southern Europe could not, there was a rift between the two parties of Europe. So it was the idea of a Europe that had to be completed by a real democratic Southern Europe. Let me mention very last, but what is excluded in all the CGL documents is the case of Soviet Union, of course. So violation of human rights in Soviet Union is not mentioned. It's true, it's a very, let's say, again, is a very Southern European discourse. It's pretty much focused. So on one side is, let me get to this conclusion. It's not raised that much the universalism of the discourse on human rights, but much more the European meaning of that discourse. So exactly in the direction, thank you for bringing me to this point that I didn't have clear in my mind. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Julia.
I have two questions. First of all, connecting to what Carlos said, was similar regarding what I was asking for, that is the idea of democracy. So if you think that in this Southern European space, so there was a similar idea of democracy. So if we think about the different conceptualization of democracy, maybe the different countries have a different idea also of what we mean with liberal democracy and the actors involved in this action of humanitarianism. So indeed, it's the very thing that I'm struggling now, because, for instance, in an article, they told me that we cannot compare Italy, where there was a democracy, even if I'm totally agree with you that there were huge problems during the 70s and at the end of the 60s. So what you think about the conceptualization of democracy, and I think that is quite groundbreaking, the idea that you connect, if I understood well in your project, the idea of human rights solidarity action with the construction of democracy in all these countries. So if you can delve in more in this aspect, because if we think about Eastern Europe, so if they are not going to speak about human rights in Eastern Europe, so what kind of idea of democracy they have? And then the other is another point that in the article with Alan we were struggling with is solidarity and humanitarianism. So
Yeah.
We can think about humanitarianism. Solidarity is the big, I don't know, field, and then humanitarianism. So we can think about solidarity as humanitarianism. So I don't know.
Okay. All easy questions. Thank you. Very, very challenging questions. Thanks a lot, Julia. Okay, I don't want to say well prepared, but I'm prepared to your first question because Alan asked me a very similar question in the workshop we had on humanitarianism and transition to democracy. So thanks to your question, I have been, thinking about the issue of how is conceptualized democracy. Okay, let me say this. It's not really conceptualized. Is never conceptualized as such. And also, at least in the documents I have seen, which are the documents, probably if I look at the theoretical production of the main leaders of the trade unions, I might find it, I'm not sure. Okay, but there are some assumptions, let's say. The first one that we are talking about, liberal democracy. I mean, is the democracy which look at the other democratic countries in Europe. Has nothing to do with the something revolutionary. Stay into the frame of other European democracies. With one fundamental, irrenounceable principle, which is social justice. So I think that the main point is not to contrast the model of liberal democracy from the political structure of the political organization, but to bring liberal democracy to full implementation, to full development through the implementation of social justice. That was exactly the fight of the Italian trade unions in those years. And this is one of the reasons why Commissiones Obreras, mainly the relationship was really with the Commissiones Obreras was much stronger than the one with others trade union organizations, but also with the Greek organization. They said that they said, we are looking at you because you are fighting for the full implementation of social justice, for the full recognition of workers' rights. So we support you. And it's very, and that leads us to the solidarity issue, but I'll be back later. It was very interesting to me to see how this solidarity was reciprocal. It was thought as something that also from the countries under dictatorship, they wanted to make clear the solidarity with the Italian trade unions who were fighting for the establishment of workers' rights in Italy. So again, and here the point is, and I go a little bit forward about how the conceptualization of democracy. What is interesting is that since they think about the full implementation of democracy as the full recognition of workers' rights, and therefore the recognition of social justice as fundamental for the construction of a democratic society, there is a strong relationship between, again, the Italian trade unions, the three of them, and the Comisiones Obreras, because they want to build common trade union policies at the end, while they are in the very phase of the democratic transition for the future. So there is a very important conference held in Italy, in Piemonte, with a huge debate between all the representatives of the Spanish trade union organization, but the most important were the Comisiones Obreras and the Italian trade unions, to discuss of common policies to be developed against the multinational development of capitalism. So the idea was, you cannot fight against capitalism in the sense to erase capitalism and build a different sort of society of democracy, but you have to contrast it and to find the room, find the space for the recognition of workers' rights and social justice in spite of the developments of capitalism and capitalist economies. And one main issue of this development was recognized exactly in the transnational expansion to the development of multinational companies. So the SEAT and the Fiat. So the idea was, let's develop a common strategy so that we can strengthen democracy or build a way for it in Spain at transnational level, as a strong democracy in Southern Europe with the respect, full respect of workers' rights. And that was a very important political initiative. Let's come to the, okay, solidarity and humanitarianism. There are two big boxes. We can put everything we like in solidarity. Solidarity means political solidarity, religious solidarity. The word solidarity has very important religious roots. And humanitarianism, oh gosh, most of the debate on the history of humanitarianism has been around the impossible definition of what the history of humanitarianism is. So the boundaries of this field of investigation are so large and so porous. So we can cross them as we like. What I believe it is important, I think we should go beyond. This is very, we all know that humanitarianism has nothing to do with neutrality and apolitical engagement. Humanitarianism is political, and it has been political from the very beginning, and this is something I'm very, I can safely say, okay? I think in some cases, we probably need to explore, and then we are talking, okay. Most of the scholarship on the history of humanitarianism has dealt with the so-called liberal humanitarianism. So international organizations that were born out of international liberalism. So, okay. And the initiatives of national state, of liberal democracies, and civil society organization of liberal democratic countries. So let's say what we can call liberal humanitarianism, and many different aspects of this so-called liberal humanitarianism have been explored. And they have always, let's say, dwelt with this ambiguous relationship between humanitarianism and politics or policies. It was political, although it was not openly political. And when I'm talking about political, I want to say humanitarianism has always been connected to the idea of a better society that people wanted to build. Then what society depended on the idea of the people engaged in the field of humanitarianism. But there was always, let's say, a political design, a political agenda. And when I speak of political, I mean a broad idea of something that you want to build, a better society you want to go to. So now I think it's the time maybe to explore the explicit connection between humanitarianism and politics and the political agenda of different actors involved in the field of humanitarianism. So I think that solidarity and humanitarianism are profoundly connected in many different ways, because everything depends on what are the meanings, plural, given to solidarity and humanitarian aid by specific actors in very specific historical circumstances. So I think we need we need to unpack these complex relationships and contextualize them in very specific frame. Sorry, I was a little bit long. No, I told you I speak too much.
Thank you. Yeah, listening to you, if we still have 10 minutes, something like that. No,
I'll try to be short.
No, in English, just for the sake of plurality of languages and so on. Yeah, I must confess, when I first knew about your project and I read in the webpage about the shaping of contemporary regime of international aid, another box, solidarity and so on. So I thought it was a project about like humanitarian aid for refugees or migrants and so on, and so also thinking about the Mediterranean and the current debates and so on and so on. So is international aid like a more encompassing concept where you can put all the other boxes there, or is it also problematic to look things from this point of view? Because also international aid made me think about development aid. And I think nothing of what you have said so far has to do with the development aid, but maybe you have still something more to show us, to tell us. So that's the question. Thank you.
Okay. Gosh, this is really difficult. Sorry. No, you're right. Okay. It was extremely difficult to, let's say, to define the boundaries of the project. Maybe we are not able to do it. We went in different directions. I want to say this is something very peculiar about our project. We were really led by sources, because at the very beginning, it was so unexplored, this field, that everything was to be done. And when we started, we realized that something that we had imagined at the very beginning was not like that into the sources. So we had to change the direction. Few points. We privileged the idea of international aid. So what we wanted to do was to explore the role of Southern European countries as international actors into the field of aid. So not the action implemented in their own countries, but in the international domain. It was just a divide, not because I think that they are separated in history, because they are very, very much related to each other, but we could not do everything. And the main point, as I stressed, that I stressed at the beginning, was to reverse the assumption that in Southern European countries were not actors into the political international arena dealing with aid. So we wanted just to explore the role that they had in that international arena, and we stayed at the international level. So, for example, we have some work on refugees, for example, but not in Italy or Portugal, but in the countries, in other countries, or some work that, more complicated. And that was the first line. At the very beginning, I didn't think about development that much, although, let's say, in the most recent scholarship, humanitarianism and development aid are really connected to each other. And the prevalent position is that international development aid is part of the broad, of the largest box of humanitarianism. And actually, I'm pretty convinced that it really is, because of the practices. As you understood, probably, I'm really engaged in exploring practices. I'm not a theoretical woman. I like the idea of exploring practices, and I see that practices are related to each other. And also, I like exploring labels. So, at the international level, you find this label of humanitarianism, which somehow covers also development aid. In Southern European countries, it's the opposite. You see that in many cases you find the label development aid, and you have some work that is really the sort of work that usually we regard as humanitarian. So it's pretty much entangled and intertwined, and we do have, I would say, a lot of work on international development aid, also because for Southern European countries, the engagement with international development aid was very large. For example, Grazia, she was here, Grazia Sciacchitano, she's dealing also with development project developed by Spain in Latin America. After, before, during, and after the transition to democracy. And I myself dealt with the engagement of Italy into the and Italian NGOs in development aid. And that was very important, mainly in Northern America, in Northern African countries. But that was important because, this is my position, just to put it very briefly, it was important because the development aid was a tool to get a position in international arena and to be recognized as foreign, to be recognized into the foreign policy at international level. So I think it was very important to Italy, undoubtedly, but also for the new democracies after the transition, to gain international recognition in a very specific field. That is one side of the story. The other side of the story, at least for Italy, is that it was to develop its own economy and to build, important, strong relationships with other countries in the so-called underdeveloped world that could favor the exportation policies of investment, particularly. So they're connected. So thank you so much. I hope I didn't give you the impression that my project is a vague, but I promise you that there is something connecting everything at some point. Thank you very much for your questions and comments.
¿Tenemos alguna pregunta más o comentario, observación? ¿No? Muy bien. Entonces, creo que tampoco online, así que... sí. Disculpadme, voy a leer. Estoy aquí conectado. Gracias. Pilar Domínguez. Tenemos un comentario online en el canal de YouTube que voy a leer. Muchas gracias. Pilar Domínguez Prats. Hola, Pilar. Gracias por tu observación. Según lo dicho ahora por Silvia Salvatici, como respuesta a Giulia, el humanitarismo de los sindicatos podría considerarse como un ejemplo de solidaridad, pues parten de una idea concreta de cuál sería su modelo de sociedad. ¿O no es así? Esta es la pregunta.
I'm very happy that we...
Thank you so much.
And I'm very happy that we agree. We totally agree. We are in the same line.
Como hemos dicho, muchas gracias, Pilar. Muchas gracias a todos los participantes, también aquí en la sala e intervinientes. No vamos a cansar más a nuestra ponente. Ahora vamos a hacer una pausa, ¿de acuerdo? Retomamos después de la pausa en 20 minutos o así, ¿de acuerdo? Muchas gracias a todos.
Gracias.
Thank you very much. Grazie mille.
Grazie a voi.
Excellent.